This is Jen, the Liberty Lion. Today I just want to go over a few things in Title IV U.S. Code. You can find these on Office of the Law Revision Council, United States Code. They have a list here, Title IV, and you can look through any of these various titles and you can look at it from the perspective that I'm helping you see. And you'll understand that most of these titles, if not all of them, are for the federal people on the federal lands. So, for example, in sections 106, income tax, this is where a lot of people get stuck. They see no person shall be relieved from liability. So what they're saying, well, the misunderstanding comes in when they see the words no person. And they believe that when the federal government says no person, it means no person at all whatsoever, anywhere, anytime, are relieved from liability. But that's not what it's saying. If you understand that the federal Constitution applies to the federal people on the federal land, then you understand that no person means no person within the federal jurisdiction or federal power or federal lands. So no person on federal lands shall be relieved from liability for any income tax levied by any state. So then they say, okay, so no person shall be relieved from state tax. But what the federal law is saying to the federal people is that just because you're on federal lands does not mean you're relieved from paying state income tax. So let's read it. No person shall be relieved from liability for any income tax levied by any state or by any duly constituted taxing authority therein, having jurisdiction to levy such a tax by reason of his residing within a federal area or receiving income from transactions occurred or services performed in such areas. So what this is saying is that just because you're living on federal lands does not mean that you are not required to pay state taxes in whatever way the state taxes, because some states tax your income and some states tax your purchases. So in Texas, we have a sales tax. We don't have an income tax. So at the end of the year, we don't do a state income tax return because our taxes are paid whenever we make purchases. In other states, you have an income tax, so you pay taxes on your income. So just because you're a federal person on federal lands doesn't mean that you are not required to pay state income tax or state sales tax. From the nationalatlas.gov, which this website has expired and is no longer available, the federal lands and Indian reservations. So here we have Texas, and these are the federal lands inside of Texas. So it's the federal people on the federal lands, and any contractors or civilian employees that work on the federal lands are also required to pay state taxes. They don't, they're not relieved from state taxes for the simple fact that they live or work on federal lands. In this section, Title 4, subsection 103, assent to purchase lands for forts. This portion should be really divided into two probably separate sentences, but they have it in one sentence, which makes it a little bit confusing. But it says the President of the United States. So the President of the United States, not the United States of America, but the United States. So as the Commander-in-Chief, because the President as the Commander-in-Chief is Commander-in-Chief over the military. The military are on the federal lands, and the federal lands altogether are United States. So the President of the military, being the Commander-in-Chief, is authorized to procure to the assent of the legislator of any state. Okay, so this means that the Commander-in-Chief can purchase lands inside a state so long as the legislature of that state agrees, within which any purchase of land has been made. Okay, so he has to get the legislator of the state to agree to allow him to purchase lands, and then within those lands, he can erect forts, magazines, arsenals, dockyards, and other needful buildings. And to build those things, he does not have to get consent. So he has to get the consent of the state in order to purchase the lands. And then on those lands, he can build the things that are listed in the Constitution, but he doesn't have to get permission or consent from the state legislator to build the things that are already listed in the Constitution. Specifically, the lands aren't listed in the Constitution. It just says that they have to purchase the lands, that the federal government has to purchase the lands. And then once the lands are purchased, they can build these things. So it's saying here that after they get consent to purchase the lands from the state, then they can build those things, forts, magazines, arsenals, dockyards, and other needful buildings without the consent of the legislator of the state. And here we have 4 U.S. Code subsection 110. And I'm looking at the term federal areas now. We just talked about how the federal areas are the lands inside the state that the federal government purchases. Now, I'm talking about the federal government being the United States and the states being the United States of America. So under E, the term federal area means the lands that have been purchased by the federal government for the erection of the various forts. So it says the term federal area, which means any lands or premises held or acquired by or for the use of the United States or any department, establishment, or agency of the United States, and any federal area or part thereof which is located within the exterior boundaries of any state shall be deemed to be a federal area located within such state. So you have, for example, Texas. Texas is just a land. It's a territory. Inside Texas, you have an independent state created by the settlers and inhabitants of the state, and you have a dependent state, which are the military forts, arsenals, dockyards, or the federal lands that have been purchased by the federal government, called the United States, under the Constitution, the authority of the Constitution, in order to build the things. And then once all the federal areas have been purchased, meaning all the military posts have been purchased. Those places can become a state. It's a dependent state. And so you have the term state, and the term state can include a variety of different things. Marriage is a state. The army has a state, the state of the army, the state of the union. A territory, Texas territory, Texas is a state. You have the federal areas inside Texas, and those are a federal state. So in 4 USC, the term state includes those places purchased by the federal government, because you're talking about the federal government talking about its states that it created, being the dependent states, being the military lands or the federal lands. So you have a federal area would be a post, for example, Fort Meade, Fort, whatever forts they have inside Texas. Then you have the naval air stations and naval substations and all that kind of thing. You have each individual post, but then all together, the federal lands inside Texas are the federal territories or the federal state. The federal state inside Texas. And then, of course, you have the people's state inside Texas, the free, sovereign, and independent people. So you have states that are the United States of America, which are the free states. And then you have states which are the federal areas, which are the dependent states. And we know they're dependent states because the people on those lands, in those states, are in service to the independent states and the people of the independent states. And it says it all here in the laws, and denying it doesn't change the fact that you're wrong. Denying it only makes you subject to agreeing with their laws and being under their laws because you believe that you're a part of the federal state, or that you're under the federal state, or you're part of the federal government, when you're not. The Constitution was created as a way to make laws for the federal people on the federal lands, and to build forts and take care of the federal people on the federal lands. And then there's this relationship between the on federal land people and the off federal land people, since the federal areas are all located inside the independent state. You have people on the independent state lands, and you have people on the dependent state lands. So you have military people that come off the federal lands, and they'll go to Walmart and they'll make a purchase, and they have to pay state tax. You have the federal government importing, for example, fuel from the state onto the federal lands, and so the federal government would pay the state tax. And there's no way around paying those taxes. So you have federal people that have to pay state tax, and you have the federal government, which pays a state tax. But I've not seen any law that states that state people, when not purchasing federal things, are required to pay a federal tax. So if you go onto the federal lands and you make a purchase, maybe you'll buy something sold on federal lands, you would pay a federal tax. Or if you worked for the federal government, you would pay a federal tax. But if you were not in the state, you wouldn't pay a state tax. So if you're a federal person on federal lands and you don't come off the federal lands, there's no tax for you to pay. If you don't work in the state, there's no tax for you to pay. If you do come off the federal lands and you buy a vehicle or a house, as many military people do, then you're subject to the taxes of the state. Most stores on federal lands don't charge a tax. There's no tax. I guess the federal government pays the state tax, and so there's no federal tax. But if you were to go and civilians can't go on post and buy from a commissary or exchange, but if you're in the federal government, if you're in the military, and you go to the post exchange or post commissary, there's no taxes on anything you buy. And it's probably because you're already paying an income tax. So then you have to ask, why is it that people off federal lands who don't work for the federal government are paying a federal tax? And I believe it's because you're not paying it to the federal government. You're paying it through the Federal Reserve Bank because you're using their money, the fake money. That's just my opinion, though. But when you see all these federal laws, you're seeing laws that apply to all the people within the jurisdiction of the federal government. So it can say all people all at once, but it doesn't really mean all people. It only means the federal people. So this is for U.S. Code 124 definitions. And then I go down to 12 here, taxing jurisdiction. The term taxing jurisdiction means any of the several states, the District of Columbia, or any territory or possession of the United States, any municipality, city, county, township, parish, transportation district, or assessment jurisdiction of any other political subdivision within the territorial limits of the United States with the authority to impose a tax, charge, or fee. So again, the federal laws are speaking to the federal people. The federal laws are telling the federal people that they must abide by the taxing jurisdiction, meaning they pay the federal tax if there should be one. And if they're inside of a state, they're also subject to the payment of the state tax. So if they're in a state, they pay the state tax. If they're on federal lands, they pay the federal tax. They pay whatever tax they're being charged. If people who have nothing to do with the federal government are not on federal lands, they're not required to pay a federal tax. Why do we pay a federal tax? We have nothing to do with the federal government. The relationship between states and persons residing in federal areas in those states is disarranged and disrupted with tax losses, lack of police control, and other disadvantages to the states. many residents of federally owned areas are deprived of numerous privileges and services, such as voting and certain access to courts, which are the usual incidents of residents within a state. So, in summary, what we've talked about here are the various laws and where you can find them to better understand the ideas in the Constitution. The ideas in the Constitution and the enumerated powers are clarified in the various laws. So the positive laws are the enumerated powers within the Constitution. And what I've gone over today is this idea or this law, the various laws that show you that the Constitution applies to the federal people on the federal lands and does not negate the state laws. So being on federal lands does not relieve a federal person or a civilian working on federal lands or a contractor or business on federal lands from being responsible for state taxes. And that is because the states are supposed to control the federal government. The federal government is not supposed to control the states. To see more like this, please consider liking, sharing, subscribing, and if you don't mind, take a minute to drop a comment. If you can get your friends to subscribe also, I would really appreciate that. But a lot of people won't subscribe to the libertarian or freedom channels or articles or websites. So you have to find a way to bring up this information to them so that we can expand the ideas of freedom, liberty, independence, and sovereignty.